What if I told you Prince Harry is hearing his mother's voice, and doctors fear he may be losing touch with reality? Tonight, the royal family is in turmoil as shocking revelations emerge about Prince Harry's mental health. Princess Anne has confessed that Harry claims Princess Diana speaks to him at night, guiding him, warning him, and now doctors warn he's suffering from trauma-induced psychosis. Even Prince William has broken down in private, admitting he thought Harry was being dramatic until he saw the truth for himself. What's really happening inside the Sussex household? And could this be the breaking point for the monarchy? Stay with us as we uncover the emotional testimony, secret medical reports, and the royal family's desperate plan to save Harry before it's too late. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began as a quiet murmur behind palace doors. Whispers no louder than the rustling of aged velvet curtains, too fragile to be believed and too chilling to ignore. For months, the royal family maintained a careful silence, treating Prince Harry's increasingly erratic behavior as little more than stress, perhaps burnout from public life. But that illusion shattered during a private conversation between Princess Anne and Harry, a moment so raw and deeply human it sent shockwaves through the monarchy's most stoic members. In hushed tones and with trembling conviction, Harry reportedly confided in his aunt that he hears the voice of his late mother, Princess Diana. Not just in dreams, not as a vague memory, but as a vivid, persistent presence, guiding him at night, comforting him, warning him. And, long known for her no-nonsense composure, was visibly shaken. What she initially thought was metaphor or grief-wrought exaggeration became something else entirely when Harry insisted, repeatedly, that "Mum is with me, every night." These weren't poetic memories. These were perceived as real-time interactions, conversations, guidance, instructions. Within days of this confession, Princess Anne called an emergency meeting with Prince William, and it was there that the full weight of Harry's decline came crashing down like a tidal wave over the family's long-standing wall of royal restraint. William, already strained from the years of emotional distance with his brother, finally broke. "I thought he was just acting out," he reportedly admitted. "I thought all of this was for attention, or some crusade. But I didn't know. I didn't know he was genuinely unwell." That admission marked the beginning of what insiders now refer to as the unraveling. Behind palace walls, what had once been dismissed as melodrama was reevaluated with clinical urgency. Royal doctors were summoned. Specialists in trauma and neuropsychology brought in under total secrecy. The diagnosis came swiftly and brutally. Trauma-induced dissociative psychosis, a rare and devastating condition often born from prolonged grief, suppressed trauma, and psychological isolation. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, continued to appear in carefully curated social media clips, delivering humanitarian messages, engaging in public causes, and smiling for the cameras. But the truth beneath those polished visuals was something far darker. Inside the Sussex home in Montecito, California, chaos had begun to bloom in hushed corners. Staff members reportedly noticed the shifts in behavior, Harry wandering the halls late at night, whispering to himself, sometimes smiling as though in conversation with someone who wasn't there. Other times, he would retreat entirely, spending full days in silence, locked in his study, unresponsive. It was during one of these isolative spells that Meghan reportedly made a haunting observation to a confidant. He didn't remember Lilibet's name, a sentence that landed like a thunderclap across the palace staff group chats. In a world where every word is weighed, every expression scrutinized, that moment sent shivers through even the most hardened courtiers. Could it be? Had Prince Harry, beloved son of Diana, younger brother to the future king, and father of two, begun to lose not just his grasp on reality, but even the names of his own children? At the heart of this unfolding storm lies an agonizing question. How did it get this far without intervention? Many are pointing back to that singular trauma that cleaved Harry's life in two, the death of Princess Diana in 1997. He was only 12 years old when the news broke, and the image of him walking silently behind her casket remains one of the most haunting modern visuals in royal history. But what the world didn't see then was the invisible damage, the silent erosion of a child's emotional foundation. While William, older and perhaps better shielded, found refuge in duty and eventual destiny, Harry became the lost prince, the spare, the wanderer, the boy in constant search of the mother he could never truly bury. Therapists consulted by the royal household were said to be stunned by the delayed explosion of symptoms. One noted, "This isn't unusual. Psychosis tied to grief can remain latent for decades, only triggered by a perfect storm of psychological pressures. The birth of his own children, the estrangement from his family, the public scrutiny, the unresolved rage, it all built into a crucible. And at the center of that crucible was his mother's voice. Not metaphorically, literally. And then came the voice. Or rather, the voices. It began with Diana, he reportedly said. But over time, others joined. Friends long past, voices of warning, sometimes even commands. He described them as clear as yours or mine. When asked to recall when it started, Harry allegedly pointed back to the night of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. She was standing at the end of the hall, he said. Mom. She told me not to let them win. This chilling recollection shattered the last remnants of skepticism within the family. What began as concern over Harry's distancing behavior evolved into crisis mode. For William, it was more than just a family emergency, it was personal torment. He had for so long dismissed Harry's cries for help as rebellious dramatics, a younger sibling pushing against the crown. But now, those same cries echoed in his ears with new, horrifying clarity. The royal institution, long known for burying its emotional crises under layers of protocol and pomp, faced an unfamiliar enemy, mental illness in its most naked, terrifying form. And in the middle of it all stood Princess Anne, the iron-willed daughter of Queen Elizabeth II. It was she, not Charles, not William, who first stepped forward and said, "This is no longer something we can hide." Her bond with Harry, forged through mutual disdain for royal pageantry, became a lifeline. In a rare private audience, she reportedly urged King Charles to authorize immediate psychiatric intervention. Charles hesitated. He feared scandal, and remained resolute. If we lose him, the silence will be our guilt. At the same time, pressure mounted on Meghan. Publicly, she remained poised, protective, and polished. Privately, sources close to her claim she struggled to reconcile the man she married with the stranger who now paced their home, talking to ghosts. Some allege that she tried to cover up his deteriorating condition out of fear it would damage their brand. Others claim she fought tooth and nail for him to get the help he needed. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the murky in-between. And so here we are. The world now stands on the edge of a royal revelation that could redefine everything we thought we knew about Prince Harry. This isn't a scandal. This is a tragedy unfolding in real time. A once vibrant royal, a symbol of youth and rebellion, now potentially slipping into psychological darkness. And unlike past royal dramas steeped in betrayal, romance, or ambition, this one is drenched in heartbreak. Because beneath all the headlines, all the rumors, all the speculation, is a man who simply misses his mother. So deeply, so painfully, that the very sound of her voice, real or imagined, is the only thing keeping him afloat. But what happens when even that voice begins to turn on him? As we dive deeper into this exposé, we will unpack each layer of this unfolding crisis. From the early warning signs ignored by those closest to him, to the palace's frantic scramble for damage control, to the heartbreaking moment when William realized the brother he once knew might be gone forever. We'll hear from medical professionals, leaked insider sources, and emotional testimonies from those still trying to piece together the full picture. This is more than a story about mental illness. It's about grief, family, silence, and the terrible cost of putting tradition over truth. So buckle in, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about Prince Harry, the royal family, and the crown's most guarded secret. The confession didn't happen in front of flashing cameras or inside Buckingham Palace's grandeur. It unfolded far from the public eye, within the quiet walls of Balmoral, an estate steeped in royal history, yet eerily quiet during off-season visits. There, during a cool autumn weekend, Princess Anne sat beside her troubled nephew as he finally opened the floodgates to something so profound, so terrifying, it would change the way she, and eventually the entire royal family, saw him. The wind outside carried the dry rustle of leaves across the stone courtyard as Anne, always composed, tried to read the emotion in Harry's face. He looked tired, not simply fatigued, but worn down in a way that seemed etched into his bones. The conversation had started casually, Harry asking about his cousins, about her horses, even recalling fond memories of their time at Sandringham. But there was something behind his eyes. A distance. A wait. Then came the sentence that froze time. She talks to me. Every night. and blinked. Who? Mom, Harry whispered, his voice trembling. She stands at the foot of my bed. Sometimes in the hallway. She tells me things. She tells me to be careful. Sometimes, she warns me. There was no humor in his tone. No sarcasm. No grin that might suggest he was being dramatic. Just a deep, hollow earnestness that made his heart tighten, and had seen grief in many forms. She had walked behind her father's coffin, stood silent at her mother's memorial, and watched countless ceremonies where the weight of royal duty was balanced against the heaviness of private sorrow. But this was different. This was personal. And this wasn't a cry for attention, it was a cry for help. She leaned forward carefully, measuring her words. You mean, you dream of her? Harry shook his head slowly. No, not dreams. Not memories. I see her. I hear her. She answers when I speak. And didn't speak right away. Her mind raced, flipping through every explanation. Grief hallucinations, suppressed trauma, maybe even a need for spiritual connection. But Harry's eyes, those haunted Windsor blue eyes, told her this was no fleeting emotion. This was recurring. And it was consuming him. How long has this been happening, she finally asked. Since the Queen's funeral. That night, it started then. At first, I thought it was a dream. But it wasn't. She was there, dressed in white. And she said, don't let them silence you. And stomach dropped. That phrase, so eerily consistent with Diana's known defiance, her past fears about the institution, her concerns over being silenced, made Harry's account all the more chilling. Was it coincidence? A projection of his own paranoia? Or something else? Harry continued, detailing nights of restless pacing, nights where he'd find himself talking to her portrait on the wall, only to suddenly hear a voice answer back. Sometimes soft, sometimes commanding. Other times it came when he was driving alone, he'd hear her humming a lullaby, one he vaguely remembered from childhood. Other times, she'd tell him he was being watched, that someone close to him wasn't who they seemed. He confessed he'd begun second-guessing everyone, even Meghan. I love her, he said, but sometimes. I wonder if she understands what I'm going through, or if she just wants me to act like everything's okay. And listened, silent but alert. She had never considered herself a maternal figure. In fact, many called her the most stoic of the Windsors. But something maternal flickered inside her in that moment, a fierce need to protect the boy in front of her, now a man but unraveling. She pressed gently. Have you told William? Harry's face hardened. He wouldn't believe me. He'd think I was weak, or mad, or worse, making it up, and winced inwardly. That deep rift between the brothers had clearly festered into something toxic. Harry was isolated, perhaps even paranoid, and now burdened by auditory hallucinations that blurred the line between memory and delusion. This wasn't just unresolved grief, it was a psychological collapse waiting to happen, and left the conversation shaken to her core. That same night, after Harry had gone to bed, she walked alone through the halls of Balmoral, her boots softly tapping against the wooden floors. She paused near the portrait of Diana hanging in one of the guest lounges. The same photo that once adorned newspapers around the globe, Diana in her charity vest, smiling tenderly, and stared into that smile, wondering what secrets her eyes might still hold. She pulled out her mobile and texted William with urgency. We need to talk. About your brother. Immediately. The following morning, and returned to London and requested a confidential meeting with King Charles and Prince William. It wasn't framed as an intervention. Not yet. But it was clear to all present that something serious had transpired. In that private meeting, and recounted everything Harry had told her. Word for word. His confession, the voice, the warnings, the forgotten names, the gradual descent. Charles, aging but still caught between duty and fatherhood, sat in stunned silence. He rubbed his temples, occasionally glancing at the large window that looked out onto the palace gardens. William's reaction, however, was much more emotional. At first, he scoffed. He's always been dramatic. You know that. But as in recounted Harry's expressions, his confusion, the sincerity in his voice, the way he physically trembled, William grew quiet. Then pale. He mentioned Mum? William asked softly. Yes. Every night. He says she talks to him. She warns him. The room fell silent. William stared down at his hands. I thought he was just rebelling. Ever since he left for the States, I assumed this was about escaping the institution, proving something. But if he's hearing things... And interjected. This isn't just grief. This is something medical. Something psychological. And if we don't act now, we may lose him for good. Charles nodded slowly, reluctantly. Get Dr. Elwood. Privately. No press. No public knowledge. Dr. Elwood, the royal family's long-standing consultant in behavioral health, was discreetly flown to California within the week. The results of his visit would later trigger a silent but comprehensive health intervention behind palace gates. Meanwhile, and couldn't shake the image of Harry that evening. The way he looked over his shoulder as though expecting to see someone. The way he whispered, as if someone else was in the room. The way his voice cracked when he said, "Sometimes I think she's trying to protect me. Other times, I think she's trying to warn me about what's coming." What did that mean? What was he afraid of? Back in Montecito, Harry reportedly grew more withdrawn. Meghan was said to have been distraught following Anne's visit. The children, still too young to understand, often found their father staring blankly out the window or murmuring to himself. One staff member, who later spoke on condition of anonymity, described hearing Harry recite what sounded like a conversation at 3 a.m. He was alone in the room, pacing back and forth, speaking in calm but fragmented sentences. When asked the next morning who he had been speaking to, Harry reportedly said, "Mum came by. She's worried." It wasn't long after that when Meghan, unable to bear the escalating behavior, contacted one of the palace intermediaries asking for help. That call, too, was buried from the public eye. But it marked a turning point. Anne's whispered confession would soon become a seismic revelation, shaking the royal household into unprecedented motion. For all of her stoic reserve, it was Anne who cracked the silence. It was Anne who named the unnameable, who looked past the royal titles and saw the wounded, fractured soul of a man spiraling into something unrecognizable. And though she said nothing publicly, those close to her later said they had never seen the Princess Royal more disturbed. Because she knew what the others didn't. This wasn't just grief. It wasn't just trauma. This was a storm coming. And Harry was already standing at its center, listening to voices only he could hear. The moment the truth struck Prince William wasn't a sudden thunderclap. It was a slow, creeping realization that pressed against his chest with suffocating weight. It had started as skepticism, evolved into concern. And by the time Princess Anne had finished recounting Harry's confession, it collapsed into something far more devastating: guilt. For years, William had believed Harry was lashing out, acting out, playing the victim. He had seen his younger brother abandon the rigid but structured world of royal life and instead embrace a chaotic, media-fueled rebellion halfway across the world. It was easy to dismiss Harry's claims of trauma as melodramatic overstatements. After all, hadn't they both lost their mother? Hadn't they both stood beside her coffin, forced to grieve in public? William had endured it too, and yet he hadn't broken. That had always been his internal defense. He hadn't chosen exile. He hadn't turned his grief into a global talking point. But sitting across from, and hearing her describe the haunted look in Harry's eyes, the sincerity in his voice as he described hearing their mother's whispers, William's defenses crumbled, piece by bitter piece. He couldn't speak for several long minutes after and shared the details. The conference room within Clarence's house was dimly lit, curtains drawn, the air heavy with a silence usually reserved for moments of national tragedy. Charles had spoken first, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought it would come to this." William looked up slowly. "I thought he was just being dramatic. I thought this was about proving he didn't need us." And shook her head. "He's unraveling. And we didn't see it." William stood and paced the room, hands buried in his pockets, jaw clenched. He had never been good at expressing emotion. His grief had always been controlled, compartmentalized. It was how he survived the loss of Diana, how he carried on with royal duties, how he protected himself from the chaos that surrounded his family. But this was different. This wasn't about duty or scandal. This was his brother, and he had failed him. He turned abruptly toward Anne. "He really hears her, Mom?" And nodded. "He believes he does. Every night. She talks to him. Sometimes she comforts him. Sometimes she warns him. He's convinced it's real." William exhaled sharply. The room swayed for a moment, not physically, but emotionally. A tilt in the reality he had long constructed. If Harry's condition was truly that severe, if he was hearing their dead mother's voice, this wasn't a matter of defiance anymore. It was a matter of health, of safety. Guilt settled in his chest like a stone. All the times he'd ignored Harry's calls. All the moments he'd refused to respond to texts or speak kindly of Meghan. The time he brushed off an emotional voicemail and never called back. It all played back in his mind like an indictment. And now, his brother was spiraling into psychosis, and he had been too blind or too angry to notice. "I kept thinking he'd snap out of it," William muttered. "That he was just lost. But this isn't just about Meghan or the press. This is something deeper. Charles remained seated, his face ashen. It's in the blood, you know. Diana had her struggles. Maybe not this exact way, but she suffered. The loneliness, the panic. It shaped her. Maybe it's shaping him now. And didn't respond. Her silence spoke volumes. The unspoken truth was dawning across the room. Perhaps this was the legacy Diana had unintentionally left behind. Not just a legacy of compassion and rebellion, but one of unhealed wounds and fractured minds. Back home later that night, William found himself staring at an old photograph tucked inside a drawer in his private office. It was from a summer at Highgrove. He and Harry, both shirtless, grinning wildly beside a muddy riverbank. Diana was just off camera, laughing, her voice caught in the background of the old home video that accompanied the photo. He remembered that day. How carefree they had been. How close. When had that bond been broken? When had Harry slipped so far into isolation that he now lived between worlds? Partly in the present, partly in a grief-soaked hallucination of the past, William stayed up long past midnight, struggling with questions no royal protocol could answer. By dawn, he had made a decision. The next morning, he instructed one of his most trusted aides to arrange a call to Dr. Elwood. Quietly, no security alerts, no official notices. If Harry truly had a mental illness, William needed to know the full truth. A week later, the family received Dr. Elwood's preliminary findings. The clinical evaluation had been conducted in secret, under the guise of a wellness visit. But what the doctor discovered was anything but mild. Harry had described frequent auditory hallucinations. Most prominently, the voice of his mother. He claimed she gave him messages, told him whom to trust, advised him on public appearances. But more concerning were the moments of confusion, times when Harry failed to recognize familiar faces, moments when he'd forget entire conversations or events. The diagnosis? Trauma-triggered dissociative psychosis with severe emotional disassociation and episodic memory loss. It was a mouthful, but all William could focus on was the term memory loss. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his private chambers at Kensington Palace, watching the soft glow of London city lights. He imagined Harry alone in California, wandering his estate, hearing voices no one else could, forgetting the names of his own children, maybe even forgetting William. He wept quietly, not because of the diagnosis, but because he had lost his brother long before the illness ever took hold, and only now did he understand why. The next time William spoke publicly about Harry, albeit indirectly, it was during a charitable event focused on mental health. On stage, he paused midway through his speech, his voice catching for the first time in years. Sometimes the ones who need help the most are the ones who push you away the hardest, he said. And sometimes, we don't realize what they were going through until it's almost too late. It was subtle, but those who knew, knew. Behind the scenes, William began making quiet efforts to reach Harry again. Messages through intermediaries. Offers of support. But Meghan, perhaps cautious or overwhelmed, was slow to respond. William's grief turned into resolve. He would not abandon his brother this time. Not again. He reached out to and thanking her for telling the truth. And in that private conversation, he made a vow. If Mom really is watching, William said, then I want her to know. I'll fix this. Whatever it takes. I'll bring him back. But some close to the family worried it was already too late. Harry's condition, according to Dr. Elwood's full report, was worsening. Without consistent therapy and monitoring, the risk of a full cognitive break was dangerously high. William asked himself again and again, how did he not see it? How had the signs escaped him? The fights, the outbursts, the sudden mood changes, the paranoia. He had written them off as ego, as dramatics, as fallout from the Oprah interview. But behind every act of rebellion was a deeper cry for help. He had ignored that cry. Now, his brother's mind was slipping away, and William, the future king, the symbol of stability, stood powerless. Powerless against the very thing that took their mother. He would later describe that time as one of the darkest periods of his life. Not because of royal scandal or family disgrace, but because of a simple, searing truth. He had misjudged the person he loved most. The news came wrapped in silence. Not in the form of an official document. Not as a prepared statement from Buckingham Palace or a press release from the Sussex's PR firm. No, it came as a private message, hand-delivered to Clarence House in an unmarked envelope. marked with a seal no outsider would recognize. Inside were the preliminary findings of Dr. Martin Elwood, the royal family's trusted but rarely discussed specialist in neuropsychology and trauma-based mental health care. And the words within that envelope shattered what little hope remained of this being a temporary episode or exaggerated cry for attention. Dr. Elwood had spent just under 4 days at the Sussex estate in Montecito, posing as a discreet consultant for stress management, an identity Meghan reportedly helped arrange. He observed Harry from within the comfort of the prince's daily routine. There were long walks through the garden, impromptu talks in the library, and several subtle neurocognitive evaluations disguised as conversation. What he discovered was far more complex than any single label could explain. Harry wasn't merely suffering from depression or anxiety, though both were present. What Dr. Elwood described was a multi-layered psychological deterioration rooted in unresolved childhood trauma, compounded by acute emotional stress, and triggered into full manifestation by sustained psychological isolation. But even that definition didn't capture the gravity of what was happening. In clinical terms, the diagnosis read, trauma-induced dissociative psychosis, complicated by episodic amnesia and secondary delusional auditory hallucinations. In simple language, Harry was dissociating from reality, and not temporarily. His episodes were recurring, growing in intensity and frequency. There were gaps in his memory, periods of apparent blackouts where he recalled nothing from his day, and most alarmingly, vivid hallucinations, most notably the voice of his late mother, Princess Diana. Dr. Elwood's report was direct. The patient shows clear signs of psychosis, rooted in long-term unprocessed grief and familial emotional neglect. The hallucinations are not metaphorical but perceived as actual sensory experiences. These are not dreams, not imagination. Prince Harry believes these voices are real, and they govern much of his private behavior. He included a chart tracking the timing and context of these episodes. Most occurred at night. Harry would reportedly isolate himself, sometimes seated in silence for hours. Other times, he could be heard murmuring, pacing, even responding to what seemed to be internal voices. Meghan told the doctor that sometimes she'd wake up and find him gone, only to discover him in the nursery, staring at old photos or speaking softly to someone who wasn't there. What concerned the doctor most wasn't just the auditory hallucinations, it was how deeply integrated they had become in Harry's daily functioning. He was not only hearing Diana, he was making decisions based on her voice. He had reportedly canceled events after she warned him not to go. He had severed communications with certain family members after claiming she told him they couldn't be trusted. In one deeply disturbing case, he had reportedly deleted an entire week's worth of emails and correspondence from a charity partner after saying she said this wasn't the right path. This wasn't grief talking. It was delusion rooted in pain. The second layer of the diagnosis pointed to episodic amnesia, where Harry would forget significant interactions or facts, sometimes for days at a time. Meghan recounted one moment where he didn't recognize a staff member who had worked with them for over a year. Another time, he struggled to recall the name of a close friend they had dined with just 2 nights prior. The most haunting moment, however, came when Harry reportedly paused while reading a bedtime story to Archie, looked up at Meghan, and asked, "Have we read this one to him before?" It was a story they'd read hundreds of times. Dr. Elwood's recommendation was urgent and unequivocal. Harry required immediate, long-term psychiatric treatment, preferably inpatient, with supervised medical care, medication management, and structured trauma therapy. But that was easier said than done. Back in London, the diagnosis was met with a storm of reaction behind closed doors. William was silent for nearly an hour after reading the report. When he finally spoke, it was only to ask if Harry knew the full extent of the diagnosis himself. Charles, though visibly shaken, immediately moved into protective mode, tasking a private legal team to ensure all information would remain sealed and that no member of the press, no matter how well informed, would catch even a hint of what was happening. And meanwhile, was the only one to speak candidly in that meeting. "This isn't just an illness," she said. "This is a breakdown of the man himself. We didn't just lose control of the narrative, we lost Harry." There was talk of intervention. But the logistics were impossible. Harry lived thousands of miles away, under a different roof, governed by no royal schedule. More importantly, his mental state made confrontation dangerous. He reportedly distrusted most of the royal family at that point, save for and in William, and even then, his trust was fragile, often fluctuating by the hour depending on the severity of his hallucinations. Dr. Elwood warned against direct confrontation. He must come to treatment by choice, he said. To force his hand could result in a complete psychological collapse. And based on current patterns, we may already be close. Meanwhile, in Montecito, the atmosphere inside the Sussex estate had changed drastically. Meghan was no longer merely concerned, she was frightened. Sources close to the family said she had become increasingly withdrawn herself, trying to manage both Harry's episodes and their public image simultaneously. One insider described the house as eerily quiet during the day and unsettling at night. Staff were given fewer instructions. Security was doubled. Meghan's response to the diagnosis was complex. On one hand, she wanted Harry to be treated. But on the other, she feared what that treatment might do, not just to him, but to them as a family. She was said to be terrified that if the public ever found out, their entire foundation, their media deals, their image as a power couple, could collapse. There were rumors that she consulted lawyers about the implications of inpatient treatment, concerned about potential custody questions or even financial impact. Despite her internal battle, she ultimately agreed to a temporary therapeutic plan, but only on one condition: no formal psychiatric hospital. Dr. Elwood complied, creating a treatment plan that included regular video sessions, remote monitoring, and coordinated visits from local specialists. It was a compromise, but a dangerous one. The doctor made it clear, this is a short-term bandage on a long-term bleed. Without consistent, supervised care, I fear the delusions will worsen. And when they do, we risk losing not just his memory, but his grasp on who he is entirely. What made this diagnosis all the more tragic was how preventable it might have been. Elwood's report included a psychological timeline showing Harry's decline over the years. The data pointed to a sharp turn around the time of the Oprah interview, followed by deeper episodes of paranoia and hallucination after Queen Elizabeth's death. The stress of ongoing public scrutiny, his growing rift with William, and his increasing estrangement from his past life all contributed to a psychological implosion. But the seed of the problem was sown long before. Harry never truly grieved Diana, not in the way a child should. His pain was boxed, hidden beneath royal protocol, and frozen beneath layers of media scrutiny and public silence. That unspoken trauma fermented for over 2 decades, and when it finally erupted, it didn't come as tears or rage. It came as a voice, a soft, maternal whisper from the past, one that offered comfort, then warning, then control. William, upon reviewing the full report, asked the question everyone else had been avoiding. What happens if he gets worse? Dr. Elwood's answer was stark. If left untreated, he could lose touch with reality permanently. At that point, memories, relationships, even his sense of self, could dissolve. He may remember being Prince Harry, but he may no longer recognize what that means. The royal family had faced scandal before. Affairs, divorces, even criminal allegations. But this was different. This wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about PR. This was about the human mind. About the crumbling of a man raised in a system that never truly allowed him to feel pain until it consumed him from within. The diagnosis was not the end of the story. But it was the moment the palace, finally, could no longer look away. The hallway outside the nursery was dimly lit, the soft glow of a nightlight casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Meghan Markle heard the gentle creak of the nursery door opening. At first, she assumed it was one of the nannies checking on Lilibet, but the sound of footsteps told her otherwise, heavier, slower, familiar. She rose from bed, heart already thudding with worry. When she reached the nursery, she found Harry standing there, utterly still. His hand rested lightly on the crib rail. He didn't move when she entered. He didn't even turn to acknowledge her presence. His eyes were locked on their sleeping daughter. "Harry," she whispered gently, stepping forward. He blinked once, then slowly turned his head to her with a look of detached confusion. Is this her?" he asked. Meghan froze. "What?" He glanced back at the crib. "Is this our daughter?" Her breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She stepped forward, gently pulling him away from the crib, her voice shaking. "Of course it's her. That's Lily." Harry looked at her again, then down at his own hands, as though he were trying to ground himself in reality. I forgot," he murmured. "Her name. I couldn't remember her name." Meghan said nothing. What could she say? The man standing in front of her was not the Harry she had married. Not the cheeky royal rebel who had made her laugh until her stomach ached. This man was pale, trembling, his eyes red-rimmed not from tears, but from exhaustion and something deeper, something terrifying. That moment, Meghan would later tell a close friend, was when she realized the situation was far worse than she had let herself believe. Up until then, she had managed the symptoms quietly, even dismissively. Harry had always had mood swings. He had always been emotional, reactive, passionate. But this was something else entirely. This was a man losing pieces of himself, his memory, his identity, even his connection to the people he loved most. The next morning, Meghan canceled all her scheduled appearances for the week. She asked the staff to give them complete privacy and spent the entire day at home. Harry was erratic. He'd drift from room to room, muttering to himself, occasionally stopping to scribble notes on a pad of paper that seemed to make sense only to him. He ignored calls, barely ate, and at one point, spent nearly 2 hours in the garden, staring silently at the rose bushes planted in honor of Diana. When she finally convinced him to sit down for a conversation, he wept. "I keep seeing her," he said. "She's there every night. Sometimes she's proud of me. Sometimes she's upset. She says I've gone the wrong way, that I've trusted the wrong people." Meghan tried to remain composed, but inside, she was unraveling. "Harry," she said, "this isn't her. This is something else. You need help." He shook his head furiously. "You don't understand. It feels so real. She talks to me. She tells me things I never remembered, things only she would know." That night, Meghan locked herself in the bathroom and cried until dawn. She didn't cry because she was angry or overwhelmed by the burden of caring for someone unraveling. She cried because she was afraid. Truly, viscerally afraid. She was watching the man she loved vanish before her eyes. In the days that followed, Meghan tried everything she could think of to help stabilize him. She reached out to therapists, avoided the press, and even limited Archie and Lilibet's time around Harry to prevent confusion or fear. But the more she tried to control the chaos, the more it resisted her. Harry grew more suspicious. One day, she found him tearing through a drawer in his study, convinced someone had moved his private journals. Another day, he accused a staff member of watching him and demanded they be fired immediately. Meghan managed to calm him down both times, but the incidents were growing. Then came the moment that pushed her past her breaking point. She was preparing Lilibet for a video call with her grandmother, Doria. Harry wandered into the room mid-call, looking dazed. "Who is that?" he asked, pointing to the screen. Meghan, startled, answered, "That's my mom, Harry." He tilted his head. "Are you sure?" Meghan ended the call instantly. She took him by the hand and led him to the living room, sitting him down. Her voice was firm this time, not panicked, not pleading, just firm. "You need to let someone help you. You're not okay. And this isn't about stress. This is something bigger. Please, Harry." To her surprise, he didn't argue. He didn't shout or walk away. He simply nodded, eyes unfocused, voice hollow. "I know," he said. "But what if they take me away? What if I go somewhere and never come back?" She leaned closer, gripping his hand tightly. "I won't let that happen. But I can't protect you if you won't let anyone in." It was then that she made the call. The number had been given to her by Princess and after her visit. A confidential line to a royal-appointed clinical liaison. The person who arranged discreet interventions, silent therapy sessions, and long-term recovery programs for high-profile members of the monarchy without media involvement. Meghan's voice broke on that call. She explained the hallucinations, the memory lapses, the names forgotten. "He didn't know Lilibet," she whispered through tears. "Not just her face, he forgot her name. He forgot our daughter." The line went silent for several seconds. Then the voice on the other end calmly said, "We'll start the process immediately. But you need to prepare for resistance. From him, and from the palace." She was right. Within days, a treatment plan was proposed, but the palace pushed back. Charles feared headlines. William, despite his concern, warned that any leak could destroy what little dignity remained in Harry's public image. Meghan stood her ground. "I don't care about the monarchy," she said during a private call with the liaison. "I care about my husband. And right now, he's disappearing." But even as treatment efforts began, Meghan faced another unexpected burden: guilt. There were whispers among Harry's team, silent glances between aides, suggesting that perhaps Meghan's influence had accelerated Harry's deterioration. That the pressures of leaving the royal family, of constantly being in the media, of the lawsuits, the interviews, the relentless pursuit of control, maybe it had all been too much. Was she helping him? Or was she making it worse? The question gnawed at her. And worse, she began to fear Harry believed it too. One night, during another episode, he muttered under his breath, "Mom said not to trust anyone. Not even you." Meghan froze. She said nothing, just left the room and sobbed silently in the hallway. By then, the home was under quiet surveillance by medical professionals. A specialist psychiatrist began visiting twice a week under the guise of a wellness coach. Medication was introduced carefully, subtly. But the side effects left Harry groggy and irritable. He resented the routines, the structure, the suggestion that he was ill. He would say things like, "You all think I'm crazy," or "I'm not broken. I just see what others can't." There were brief moments of clarity. A laugh with Archie over breakfast. A warm embrace in the garden. But those were becoming rare. More often, he was elsewhere, in conversations with people who weren't there, lost in thoughts that drifted back to a past that no longer existed. Meghan, determined not to give up, leaned into her motherly instincts. She structured the days. She created calm routines. She removed triggers. But deep inside, she knew the truth. This was a storm she couldn't weather alone. And if something didn't change soon, she feared Harry wouldn't just forget names. He would forget who he was. The decision to convene the emergency meeting wasn't taken lightly. It had been decades since the royal family had held a closed-door session of such gravity. Not since the tumultuous aftermath of Diana's death had so many senior royals been summoned urgently, quietly, and under such emotional strain. But this was different. This wasn't a matter of scandal or protocol. It was a matter of life, health, and legacy. Prince Harry, son, brother, father, was unraveling, and they were running out of time to decide what to do about it. The meeting was scheduled with extreme discretion. No staff were informed beyond a tight circle of 5. It was held not at Buckingham Palace, but at Windsor Castle, an environment far from the prying eyes of the London press and still steeped in the private, ancestral energy of the monarchy. Present were King Charles III, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Catherine, Princess of Wales. An empty seat was symbolically left for Harry, though all knew he wouldn't be attending. The room was solemn. No press briefings, no official statements, no aides taking notes. Just raw conversation. Just family. Charles began the meeting with a long pause, his gaze fixed on the worn oak table before him. In his hand was a folder, Dr. Elwood's full psychological report on Harry. The weight of it was palpable, as though the pages themselves were laced with guilt and history. "I've read it," he said finally, his voice low. "Every word." And, seated to his right, nodded. "Then you understand why we're here." William, stiff-backed and silent, nodded slowly but said nothing. Camilla broke the silence. "This isn't a PR issue. This isn't something we can spin. This is," she faltered, choosing her words carefully, "a collapse. Quiet, slow, but real." Kate looked up, her voice soft. "What happens if we do nothing?" And answered flatly, "We lose him. Completely." There was no dramatic reaction. No outburst. Just silence again. The kind that lingers in places too used to ceremony and too afraid of truth. William eventually spoke. His voice was tight, but clear. He's forgetting names. Faces. He's talking to people who aren't there. And now Meghan says he doesn't always recognize their daughter. What else do we need before we step in? Charles rubbed his temples. "You know the dangers. If the press finds out." And interrupted. "Let them. Better that they find out he's getting help than he dies under our silence." Camilla frowned. "We're not suggesting he's suicidal. Are we sure?" And snapped. "Are we sure of anything anymore?" Kate leaned forward, her voice trembling. "We have to focus on the children. What kind of environment are they in? What is Archie seeing? What is Lilibet absorbing, even at her age?" The question changed the tone of the room. It wasn't just about Harry anymore. It was about legacy, what would be inherited not just in title or wealth, but in pain. William turned to his father. "We need a plan. Not speculation. Action." Charles exhaled. "And what would you propose? We can't just fly in and drag him to a hospital." And nodded. "No, but we can prepare. We can authorize medical support. Round-the-clock specialists. Discreet observation. And we can reach out to Meghan again," Kate added. "She's overwhelmed. She's scared. But she's still trying." Charles looked up. "Do we still trust her?" The question hung in the air. It was, and who answered? "Right now, we have no choice." The first decision was made that day. A formal royal medical unit would be reactivated under new parameters. Not since Prince Philip's later years had such a team been called into direct personal service. These were not just physicians. They were specialists in neurodegenerative disorders, trauma therapy, psychosis treatment. Each was vetted, loyal, silent. The second decision. Meghan would be contacted directly by Princess and who had retained the most trust from Harry since their conversation at Balmoral, and would extend a formal invitation, without pressure, without protocol, for Meghan and Harry to consider a private treatment plan supported by royal resources but controlled entirely from California. The third, contingency planning. If Harry's condition worsened to the point of danger to himself or others, the family would act. Quietly. Legally. Intervention could be executed under medical guardianship law in California, but only if Meghan agreed, or if a court deemed it necessary. William pushed for a fourth decision, one that no one in the room wanted to discuss. What happens to the line of succession? He asked. Silence again. Charles's voice was tired. It remains intact for now. But if his memory continues to degrade, William said, and if he can't even recognize his own children, how can he remain in that position? Even symbolically? Camilla interjected. We'd be stripping him of everything. After everything else? And raised a hand. This isn't about punishment. It's about preparing for every outcome. No final conclusion was reached on the matter that day, but the mere fact it was being discussed revealed the severity of the situation. They were no longer dealing with a rebellious Duke abroad. They were confronting the possible institutional and constitutional consequences of a mental breakdown within the bloodline. Before the meeting adjourned, Charles spoke once more. This family has spent generations hiding pain, burying emotion beneath titles. It's cost us dearly. It cost us Diana. It nearly cost us William. It's cost Harry more than we can even begin to measure. We won't lose him too. And nodded slowly. I'll call her tonight, she said. And we'll begin. They parted that afternoon not with relief or resolve, but with the quiet dread of knowing that even the most powerful family in Britain was powerless against the fragility of the human mind. Long before Harry became a husband, a father, or a symbol of royal rebellion, he was a boy clutching his brother's hand as they walked behind their mother's casket. The image is burned into global memory. Two young princes forced to put on a brave face while the world wept for the Princess of Wales. But what the cameras never caught was what happened after the procession, after the flowers had withered, after the crowds had gone, after the echoes of the nation's grief had faded and the heavy silence of private mourning settled in. Harry was only 12, and from that moment forward, the death of Diana wasn't just a family tragedy. It became the axis on which his entire emotional reality spun. While William, 2 years older and heir to the throne, was quietly shepherded into royal preparation with structure and expectation, Harry was left in the margins. The spare, the wild card, the one who was allowed to act out, until those actions became too loud, too messy, too public. And underneath it all, the wound of Diana's absence festered in silence. As he grew older, Harry learned to manage the pain by hiding it. At Eton, he was known for mischief and defiance. But behind the swagger and pranks was a boy who still saw his mother in his dreams. He spoke of her often in the early years, sometimes too often for those uncomfortable with emotion. But gradually, that faded. The palace encouraged strength through stoicism. Emotions were folded neatly into uniforms and state dinners. Public image took precedence over personal healing. And yet, Diana was never truly gone. She lingered in every headline, every photograph, every whisper of scandal. Her legacy, both as a humanitarian icon and as a royal cautionary tale, became both Harry's inspiration and his burden. By the time he entered his 20s, Diana had become less a person in Harry's mind and more a myth. A symbol, a moral compass he carried privately, often invoked in moments of public discontent. He admired her courage, her compassion, and most of all, her rebellion against the very institution that he now began to resist. In interviews, Harry often spoke about how he felt his mother's presence, how she guided him. At the time, these remarks were taken metaphorically. They were sweet, even romantic. But those close to him now believe those were the early signs. That even then, Diana wasn't just a memory. She was becoming a presence in his daily life, real, comforting, and increasingly essential. After marrying Meghan, Harry often drew parallels between his wife and his mother. He would say Meghan had the same fire, the same empathy, the same courage to speak out. But others noticed that these comparisons grew more obsessive with time. Every disagreement with the royal family was viewed through Diana's lens. Every slight, every act of exclusion, every tabloid hit, Harry internalized as proof that history was repeating itself. He reportedly once told Meghan during a heated moment, "They're doing to you what they did to her. I won't let them do it again." The protective instinct, so deeply rooted in grief, began to evolve into something more consuming. Diana wasn't just a memory anymore. She was a reason, a motivator, a moral voice in every decision he made. And when the pressures of royal life reached their peak, that voice grew louder. Sources close to Harry during the couple's final days in the UK recall moments where he became unusually reflective. Staff say he often walked alone at night, visiting memorial sites, or simply staring up at the sky from palace gardens. He would speak softly, as if having a conversation with someone no one else could see. At first, people assumed it was part of a grief ritual. But with hindsight, those moments now seem more like preludes to something deeper. After their departure from the royal family and relocation to California, the intensity of Harry's emotional connection to his mother reportedly deepened. Free from the rigidity of the palace, his mind seemed to open, along with the grief he had buried for over 20 years. He immersed himself in projects that echoed Diana's legacy. Charities, documentaries, mental health initiatives. But behind the scenes, there were signs of strain. Insiders recall that he would sometimes cancel meetings last minute, claiming he was overwhelmed. He grew increasingly sensitive to criticism, convinced that some larger force, perhaps even members of his own family, were orchestrating campaigns against him. Meghan, at first, supported his heightened emotions. She believed, like many did, that he was simply processing years of neglect and trauma. But even she began to grow concerned when Diana's presence began surfacing in everyday conversations. He'd say things like, "Mum wouldn't like this," or "Mum warned me about this," said one former staffer. But it wasn't just in passing. It was like he truly believed she was guiding him. And then came the night of the Queen's funeral. According to Meghan's private account to royal medical liaisons, that was the turning point. That night, Harry reportedly experienced what he described as a visitation. He claimed to have seen Diana at the end of the corridor in their private residence. She was wearing white. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching him. When he spoke of this later, he didn't treat it like a dream. He insisted it was real. "She was there," he told Meghan. "She looked right at me." From that point forward, the episodes became more frequent. He would wake up claiming Diana had spoken to him in his sleep. Sometimes the messages were simple. Other times, more alarming. Warnings. Instructions. And while some might interpret these as the expressions of a grieving son trying to make sense of the world, Harry didn't see them as metaphor. He believed them. Meghan began keeping a journal of these moments. Not to exploit or weaponize them, but to understand. To track what was happening. To recognize patterns. It quickly became evident that Diana's visitations were increasing in frequency and intensity. And worse, they were starting to shape Harry's behavior. He pulled out of charitable deals suddenly, citing reasons only he could understand. He became increasingly paranoid about family members back in the UK. At one point, he reportedly removed a photo of William from his study, saying she doesn't trust him. His connection to Diana had evolved beyond grief. It had become entangled with identity, memory, and delusion. During one therapy session arranged privately, Harry was asked to describe how he saw his mother now. He reportedly said, "She's still watching. She's with me. And she tells me I'm doing the right thing, that I need to protect my family, even if it means walking alone." The therapist noted that Harry's eyes remained fixed on a single spot in the room while he spoke, as if addressing someone seated just beside the chair. The royal family, upon hearing these accounts, began to understand the depth of the psychological entanglement. This wasn't simply about losing a mother too young. It was about carrying her like a shadow, a constant companion, a guiding force that had shifted from comforting to consuming. And it raised a chilling question. What happens when the voice that once brought peace begins to lead you away from reality? For Harry, Diana's voice had once been the thing that anchored him, the memory that made him feel loved in a world that often felt cold. But as the years passed and the pressures mounted, that voice became louder than all others. It began to shape not just his feelings, but his decisions, his fears, his relationships. And now, as doctors warned of worsening dissociation, they feared that if intervention didn't come soon, Harry would lose his ability to distinguish between past and present. between memory and hallucination, between love and madness. Diana's legacy will forever live on in her children. But for one of them, that legacy had become a mirror too cracked to reflect the world as it is. Even before Prince Harry's mental health became a subject of whispered conversation behind palace walls, the accusations against Meghan Markle had been simmering in the background. Some saw her as the catalyst of his estrangement from the royal family. Others believed she was his lifeline, his greatest defender in a world that had always misunderstood him. But as Harry's condition deepened and disturbing details emerged about his hallucinations, paranoia, and episodes of memory loss, a fresh wave of suspicion began to rise. And at the center of it, once again, stood Meghan. The headlines didn't come right away. At first, the palace controlled the narrative barely. But word began to leak in whispers, and clues dropped by those close enough to notice Harry's detachment. The public, ever eager for answers, began to ask the inevitable. Was Meghan helping Harry? Or was she hiding something? It started with body language. Clips of Harry and Meghan at public events were reanalyzed by online sleuths and royal commentators. Every side glance, every hand on the back, every interrupted sentence was pulled apart and examined. Was she controlling him? Was she silencing him? One particular video, filmed during a charity event in Los Angeles, drew particular attention. In it, Harry began answering a reporter's question about the royal family but stopped mid-sentence after Meghan subtly placed her hand on his arm. He nodded, smiled, and said, "Never mind." To most, it was a nothing moment. To others, it was confirmation of a broader pattern. Harry wasn't just being protected, he was being directed. But the real concern came from within the Montecito estate itself. Former staff, bound by NDAs but rattled by what they witnessed, began to hint that Meghan had become increasingly involved in monitoring Harry's behavior. She reportedly kept track of his appointments, managed access to his communication devices, and personally reviewed his interactions with therapists. It could all be interpreted as support from a concerned spouse, or, in the eyes of some, as manipulation. She was always present, one insider claimed. Harry never met alone with anyone, not even his doctors, unless Meghan was nearby or listening. That may have been about trust, but it felt like control. The staffer went on to say that on multiple occasions, Harry was discouraged from speaking to his brother or father unless Meghan reviewed the message first. There was always a pause, a filter, a moment where she would say, "Maybe wait," or "That doesn't sound like a good idea." Supporters of Meghan dismissed these claims as classic misogyny, another chapter in the ongoing effort to vilify a strong, outspoken woman. But as Harry's psychological state deteriorated, it became harder to ignore the contrast between her polished public presence and the quiet chaos behind closed doors. Meghan was managing a household on the edge. Her husband was hearing voices. Her family was under surveillance by both doctors and tabloids. And she, somehow, had to hold it all together. But holding it together often meant keeping secrets. Medical professionals began to express concern that Meghan was selectively disclosing Harry's symptoms. In early therapy sessions, she reportedly downplayed the frequency of his hallucinations. Later, when a new specialist joined the team, they were shocked to learn how long the episodes had been occurring. There was a gap, one clinical consultant noted. The picture we were given didn't match what we eventually observed. That discrepancy delayed our intervention. Others began to question whether Meghan feared the consequences of full transparency. If Harry was formally diagnosed and treated under legal guardianship, what would that mean for their family dynamic? Their children? Their brand? Some royal insiders believe she was caught in a terrible dilemma, desperate to save Harry but terrified of what doing so would cost. And then came the rumors, whispers that Meghan had begun controlling Harry's medications, that she had veto power over any prescriptions, that she had stopped one particular treatment plan out of fear it would make him too lethargic for a public appearance. None of these claims were confirmed, but they gained traction online, fueled by Meghan's long-standing critics and the ever-churning royal gossip machine. The truth may have been far less sinister and far more tragic. By all accounts, Meghan was overwhelmed. She had become a caregiver, a gatekeeper, a mother of 2 small children, in the face of a multi-million-dollar brand. She had married into a family that treated her as an outsider, and now that same family was looking to her to fix what they never dared to acknowledge in their own ranks. She was expected to be Harry's protector, his healer, his mirror, and she was losing him. According to one close associate, Megan's breaking point came late one evening when she found Harry in the garden talking to someone who wasn't there. When she asked who he was speaking to, he looked at her with the clarity of someone entirely elsewhere and said, "Mom says you don't understand." Megan collapsed into a chair, sobbing, not just from fear, but from the crushing realization that the man she loved no longer trusted her in full. That Diana's voice, real or imagined, now outranked her own. After that incident, Megan reportedly backed away from controlling his treatment. She allowed the royal medical liaison more direct access. She agreed to new medications, new evaluations. But the public had already made up its mind. Commentators began referring to her as the gatekeeper. Op-eds asked if she was shielding Harry from help. YouTube conspiracists claimed she had something to gain from his breakdown: money, influence, even sympathy. It was a familiar pattern, but this time it cut deeper. This wasn't just about protocol or privacy. This was about mental illness. And in the public eye, Meghan was quickly becoming the villain in a tragedy far larger than herself. Behind the scenes, William and Kate were briefed on the growing tension within the Sussex household and expressed concern that Meghan might be unknowingly enabling certain delusions. She may not understand what she's dealing with, and reportedly said, she's trying to protect him, but she may be protecting the illness too. There was even discussion about assigning a third-party advocate, someone neutral, who could mediate treatment decisions between Meghan and the medical team. But Charles feared such a move would destroy any remaining trust between the two households. For her part, Meghan remained outwardly calm. She made appearances, smiled for cameras, pushed forward with podcast episodes and philanthropy. But those close to her noticed the change. Her eyes, once fierce and unshakable, had grown weary. Her voice, once confident and bright, now carried the tremble of someone too often holding back tears. She had not caused Harry's breakdown. That much was becoming increasingly clear to those who truly understood trauma. But she had been drawn into its gravitational pull and was now orbiting dangerously close to its center. And perhaps most painfully, she could not save him. Because every time she tried, she heard those words again. "Mom says you don't understand."